Conversation with a Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College, and today we're really lucky to have Stan Brunn, professor emeritus at the University of Kentucky. Stan, so many thanks. It's really great to have you here today.
Good to be here.
Great. You know, like I ask many others, I'll ask you about your background. Perhaps you could comment on your childhood and note if there was anything in your childhood that perhaps inspired you later to pursue a career in geography, and then talk about your undergraduate and graduate studies, if you will. Would you care to share some insight?
Well, I think that my background, as I will share with you, is very geographical. My father was a rural Presbyterian minister in the Midwest, and he was a very challenging pastor, and we moved to a lot of different places in part because his congregation just didn't like him after a few years. So by the time I graduated from high school in 1957, I had lived in 5 different Midwestern states. I've lived in Wisconsin, Minnesota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Missouri, and Illinois. And these were places where in country schools, I went to one-room country schools, I went to small towns. Big cities to me were they were another planet. Mm-hmm. So I think that background of living different places and having friends in different places meant a lot to me as I grew older. I also like to read books about travel. I've always liked to read books about travel. And the name Ewan Galloway Richard Halberton would come to mind of people. And they were people who traveled around the world and took photographs and made maps. So I'd go to the county library and read something that they'd written. But also I collected stamps. I'm a lifelong stamp collector, starting at age 7. And I collect stamps from different countries, and I started very early to collect map stamps, which were kind of a specialization. I also would write missionaries. I'd write missionaries in different parts of the world and ask them about their work and about their environment, about their cultures, and I learned from them as well. So by the time I graduated from high school, I had this kind of a cosmopolitan Midwestern background, but also a strong international flavor to my interests. And when I went to undergraduate school at Eastern Illinois University for 3 years, I graduated after 3 years, I took courses in German, and French, and Spanish, but also courses in geography. And some of my best teachers were in geography, but some of them were not in geography. But they all kind of inspired me to want to learn about places and landscapes and regions and cultures and diversity. So this kind of a background was very critical, I think, to my going to University of Wisconsin-Madison for my master's and for Ohio State for my PhD work. Those 2 departments in the early 60s were quite different. So as I share with my friends that Madison sort of educated the right side of my brain, then Ohio State did the left side of the brain. And both were really critical. I think if you only had one side of the brain developed, you're probably missing the other half part of your brain. And after I graduated from Ohio State University, then my first job was at the University of Florida. I wanted to get out of the country, out of the Midwest. And this was in the mid-1960s, which is a lot of tumultuous social upheaval time with racial issues and gender issues and Vietnam War. But I wanted just to get outside the Midwest. So I taught at the University of Florida for 3 years. I wouldn't trade those 3 years for anything. But I had many other peers I went to graduate school with that were scared to death of teaching in the South, getting outside the Midwest. So their comfort zone was probably limited, but mine has always been very extraterritorial and very international. Mm-hmm. Some of my best teachers at Madison were Carl Butzer,
Oh, Butzer?
Yeah, he's one of my best teachers. And also, I think John Alexander was good. Glenn Treworth,
Alexander.
my advisor.
Alexander had this tremendous reputation for being an exemplary teacher, and he authored that economic geography textbook.
Correct. And his book was really a breakthrough because it was the first economic geography book that had something about regression in the back in the summary part of the book. But Butzer really educated me about the importance of what you call prehistoric geography, the linking of landscapes and humans. Fred Simoons was another good colleague of mine. Yeah, he eventually left Madison, went to teach in California.
At Davis,
Davis, right. And Steve Jett was also at Steve. Steve Jett was who's a faculty member for a couple of years at Columbus when I was a grad student.
And he also went to Davis.
Yeah, that's right. So they both went to Davis. But when I went to Ohio State, my advisor was Les King. And he was a early quantitative economic geographer at that time. And I just thought it was important to know something about this evolving part of the discipline. And I think it was good to have that urban economic quantitative mix. At that time, we didn't have people who specialized in urban geography. Social geography basically did not exist. When you think about people studying racial issues, gender issues, those are really kind of mid-1960s and onwards. Then after Ohio State, then I went to Florida for 3 years, and I went to Michigan State for 11 years, and I came to the University of Kentucky in 1980 as chair of the department.
Let's go back to Ohio State, and I'm wondering if you could comment on individuals that you found to be particularly inspiring at Ohio State. You commented that Les King was your advisor, and you completed a dissertation associated with central place theory comparisons, which was, I think, pretty intriguing. Might even be worth revisiting it today at some point. But and you did comment on Steve Jett being there. Anybody else that you found to be particularly noteworthy?
Well, also Jim Wheeler was also taught at Ohio State for a couple of years. He was getting his PhD from Indiana University. He and I became good friends, and we co-authored some things together, and we still did early in our careers. But I think the importance of learning about urban economic geography was very important, and especially quantitative methods. It was a perspective. You look back 30 or 40 years differently than when you were a grad student. But I think at that time it was important, I think, to know something about this evolving quantitative metric part of geography that was evolving, instead of basically regional descriptive. And I had professors on both sides of the spectrum there, but I think that the quantitative methods were very important early in my career, and still were in learning even something about social theory or learning about metrics that are even used in the discipline today. But I went to graduate school with people who didn't want anything to do with quantitative methods, but their careers were really kind of cut short because, as you know, that quantitative methods sort of evolved into the discipline and everybody took it. Whether you were, unless you maybe were in historical cultural geography, you didn't see any read for it. But really, human geography really evolved from the 60s onwards with social geography and political geography below the international level. I had a strong interest in political geography, but not necessarily at the international level, because that's what was taught in political geography in the 1960s and early 1970s. I was really interested in local, regional, national political issues. And one of my first books dealt with political geography in the United States. So that's part of my career.
Were your years at Michigan State then influential in crafting that manuscript and cultivating your interest in political geography in the U.S.?
There are very, very few, less than a handful of geographers that were studying political geography below the international level. Roger Casperson was one of them. But there are very, very few geographers studying political issues at a national level and especially at a local level.
Mm-hmm.
So I think my years at Michigan State were building relationships with geographers elsewhere in the United States, but also these are kind of evolutionary years in social geography,
Mm-hmm.
studying racial issues and gender issues and peace issues. And I was probably one of the few geographers working on those topics at that time. But now they're kind of standard. But at that time it was not. It's just a different way of looking at the world. And I think as I've been around colleagues at Michigan State and especially the University of Kentucky, they've educated me about learning alternative ways of looking at places and landscapes and people and cultures, and that's still very influential.
Mm-hmm. And so you did spend several years at Michigan State. Would you care to comment on your role in the department and other colleagues that were particularly striking at the time?
I think I mentioned before Jim Wheeler. Mm-hmm. Jim Wheeler taught at Michigan State as well, but then Jim Wheeler left and went to the University of Georgia. And he was one of the very few early geographers who was trained in the Midwest that went to teach in the South, because there was a strong dislike of the South in the 1960s and 1970s, as you know. Mm-hmm. And he almost had to kind of buck the system to want to teach in places like Florida or Alabama or Mississippi. And my colleagues think, why in the world do you want to go there? Why don't you teach in Iowa or Minnesota or New York or Pennsylvania? Those are, quote, safer places. But I'm not that kind of a person. But I think that the colleagues at Michigan State that outside of Jim Wheeler that influenced me, one would have been John Hunter, mm-hmm. who was one of the pioneers in medical geography.
Sure.
And I think that he was an important one. Duke Winters, who was a physical geographer interested in
wonderful
landscape.
Geomorphologist. He did some work for the Army at West Point. And
yes, right.
Mm-hmm. Military geography as well.
Right. So these are, but also I was building at that time a strong international network. Mm-hmm. And I was interested in traveling internationally. And that kind of was stimulated in part because Michigan State is it's a very international university. Mm-hmm. In terms of student body, in terms of faculty, in terms of paying for going to conferences and travel elsewhere. And that probably was stimulated more by my years at Michigan State than anything else. But also became interested in traveling internationally. And one summer I had a grant from University of Florida to study in the Caribbean. I went to probably about more than a dozen Caribbean islands. First time at Michigan State was I went to Europe for a conference or two, mm-hmm. Went to Latin America. And that's kind of been building on for the past 30, 40 years. And now I've traveled in over 110 countries around the world on all continents except Antarctica. And I have friendships that I've established in those places, but that's also come with other tasks dealing with the AAG, like we was editor of the Annals, editor of the PG. Those are good ways to kind of build a network, and those networks continue. So I regularly, daily, I communicate with people around the world on all continents. So it's really a global friendship and a global network that really, and I'm still using it to try to learn and to relearn.
Well, yeah. it certainly enhances one's understanding of events and circumstances that people are faced with across the globe, and yeah. it again facilitates your understanding of many things from gaining those perspectives from a variety of people. It's very valuable for sure.
Yeah.
So you decided to go to Kentucky. Would you care to relate to how this came about? How your decision to go to Kentucky came about?
Well, when I was at Michigan State, the department made a decision to appoint somebody else as new chair of the department. I competed for the position, but lost the position to somebody else. And that's a whole nother story. But then I decided to go to the University of Kentucky because it was a faculty that had a good, strong mix of faculty members from major departments, Penn State, Minnesota, and elsewhere, that I really kind of respect. Syracuse, that I really respected, and that had a strong human geography focus. So I'm glad I came here and have helped build the department. It's probably now one of the strongest departments in the College of Arts and Sciences. But I think,
and certainly one of the top departments in American academic geography today.
And I think it's built. Its standing is based on not only quality faculty coming from high quality programs, but I was thinking the other day is that how many of my colleagues have been and still are editors or sub-editors of major journals. That in itself is very good for a department to have that kind of a standing. And I mentioned to the present chair of the department, I can't think of any other department in the United States that has had as many editors or associate editors of major geography journals than the University of Kentucky. I think that's very, very important. The other point I think to keep in mind, because all this, at the same time, all I'm sharing with you, the discipline was also changing. And when I was at Michigan State University, there was a large faculty, probably about maybe 15, 18 faculty members. But building a department at that time meant we need somebody in A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H. Well, so that's we had one of a kind. But that's not the way departments are identified and attract students and faculty today. Now the graduate students look for clusters, don't they? They look for clusters of faculty that have 2 or 3 or 4 people with similar interests. And that's very good. I think that's very good, especially in this electronic age and mobility change in the academy. So I think the department here, I used to teach political geography, and there's now no one who's specifically teaching only political geography. There's kind of a mix of political, social, economic, cultural, development, gender, all those are kind of mixes. And I think that's the way the discipline is much stronger now than it was 20 or 30 years ago. I also see that the discipline is becoming much more of an exporter of concepts, not only maps, but also the exporter of knowledge. But also I see that geographers are bringing imports in from other disciplines. So I think the higher education atmosphere, as you know as well as I do, that it's becoming increasingly like an archipelago, not like an island. And I think an island department is going to be like an island planet somewhere in the ocean. But I think that strong departments are going to be those that have built bridges with other disciplines. The department at the University of Kentucky is in an 18-story office tower. It's like a silo. And I would ride up the elevator every day with mathematicians, sociologists, political scientists, social workers, people in humanity, people in history. And that's a whole different daily experience than if you're only around people in a building that share the same knowledge you do. So I like the fact that I could ride up and down the elevator and be on different committees and university committees and doctoral examinations with people in humanities and social sciences. That's influenced in large part how I look at knowledge and how I look at the development of knowledge and the training of students. I think faculty members that are hired these days, departments are not looking for a silo. They're looking for muesli, aren't they? They're looking for a mix of talents that can apply to teach maybe a course with somebody in humanities, maybe with somebody in social work, maybe with somebody in health sciences, and that's good. And I think geography is a discipline built on concepts, basically on where concepts. And I think that's the way that we advance. I was in communication with somebody a couple of days ago about comparing geography and history. And people often compare geography and history. But geography, in my mind, is in a a very good position to help influence a knowledge base or a new knowledge specialization in any field because it's visual and maps.
Mm-hmm.
Historians like text. They like tables. So if you read a history book, it might have 300 pages, but maybe one map, no maps, and maybe one photograph. Well, geography is full of maps, full of visuals, full of photographs. But this is what's important, I think, Mike, is that we live in a highly visual world. Look at the social media. Look at photographs. Look at images on the internet. This is visual. And it's not simply just putting it in, inserting it, it's also how do you read it? How do you read maps? That's different from say, well, just put a map in a chapter and go on to the next page. But reading a map and everything happens both in time and in place, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
Then we need to spend time looking at place mentions, place importance, place dimensions with respect to anything that goes on with anyone anywhere. I was communicating with a friend the other day who I've invited to write a contributed chapter on segregation.
Mm-hmm.
And we were talking about housing in the 1960s and 1970s. And I said, why don't you try to find out the first maps that were made of segregated housing? I did a paper one time on open housing in Flint. That's a different story.
Mm-hmm.
But there's something about the first maps that showed segregation. You can talk about segregation in a text. You can show it in a table. But a map is a different story, a different way of communicating something, isn't it? And the same thing is true with gender. The same is true with prejudice. The same is true with bias. The same is true with maps. Maps are key. And I think, in many ways, I think that geography has been underestimated in the humanities and social sciences as a way in which to analyze what happens where and why. That's our key question to me, whether it be climate change, whether it be sustainability, whether it be in terms of gender inequality, whatever it may be, language, it all has to do with something about understanding something about maps.
Indeed. It's interesting you should bring this up because it seems like this matter of mapping in many places is de-emphasized with reference to the interpretive process.
Correct.
The engagement of not just producing a map, but interpreting what this map essentially is providing us. What kind of information are we given by examining this map? And if we compare this map to another one, what does this tell us about this particular place? Unfortunately, we are not spending enough time, I don't think anyway, in engaging in this interpretive aspect of geography. And it's a gift that our discipline has.
But also you're right, and also it's by asking questions are oftentimes not going to be able to know the answer.
Mm-hmm.
So some kind of scholarly humility is part of this effort. I heard a lecture several years ago by a very noted geographer. I'm not going to mention the name, and he was talking about global warming and talking about maps of global warming. So I asked the person, how do you explain this map that shows less degrees about global warming and more degrees about global warming? He said, well, I've never really thought about that. Well, give me a break. Putting something on a map is not that difficult. You can ask a grade school kid to do that. But interpreting it means you may have to use some fuzzy reasoning, may have to use some knowledge brought from another discipline. But interpreting something visual, it's like reading a photograph, isn't it? Reading a photograph, look at places and people and culture and all that mix is part of that interpreting of the photograph. So I think that geography has a major role, and I see this, I'm optimistic about the younger generation. It's optimistic in terms of being able to look at the humanities and social sciences in ways that we can help understand the meanings of places and regions and networks and movements, whatever they may be. And they can help us too. So we have a vehicle which is becoming very, very popular in contemporary knowledge world. But I think it's going to be teaching and reteaching, which is part of the joy of being part of a knowledge-oriented institution. I'll give you another example. We talk about global warming, talk about climate change. I've been working on a project that looks at what's the knowledge base? Think about this. What's the knowledge base about climate change? Well, you can say, well, I can look at a couple articles, I can see a couple chapters in books. But what I've done is looked at the Google search engine. And for over almost 200 countries, I put in the capital city and climate change, that combination, just to kind of see how much do we know about climate change in the world's capital. So if you think about it, basically about 200 capital cities and entering into hyperlinks, whether it be Bogota, Colombia, plus climate change. But what did I find out? Something which really surprised me is that most of our knowledge about the knowledge in Google search engine is a good basis for knowing something about something. How much do we know about something? And probably in the large majority of what we know about climate change is in the rich world. We do not have very many publications dealing with climate change in Africa, most of the countries of Asia, except for China and India and Japan, South Korea and Singapore, and Latin America. So those are opportunities, I think, for us to learn about places that we just are not studying. And the question I've raised to people, can one even get a research grant to study climate change in Central Africa? No, we'll give you research funds to study climate change in Denmark and Italy or in Japan, but not simply in Laos and Vietnam and Cambodia. So it's an interesting perspective. I didn't know I would find this. And this is an interesting point because it tells me something about our knowledge base is very, very uneven.
Well, and it shows our bias as well in seeking to achieve that knowledge.
Sure. And do we want to correct it? Well, I would hope we'd want to correct it. It'd be interesting if you put in the same database hunger. We probably know much more about hunger in Europe and North America than we do in Africa or in Central America and much of the Pacific Islands. Mm-hmm. So again, it's just a questions. I think that it's one of the joys of doing something. You find out some things you just didn't know. And the same is true with respect to gender issues. I'm editing a book now I call Parallel Universes.
Indeed. And what I believe you're relating here is what appears to become increasingly evident, and that as much as we might seek to practice social and environmental justice,
correct,
we have our shortcomings, and we need to address those shortcomings if we wish to become increasingly relevant. Yes,
we have to. But I think first, it's what would you do if you read this article and said that 70% of our climate change database is in the top 50 countries of the world. Mm-hmm. 30% are in almost over 160 countries, and we don't know very much about them. Do we want to know more about them? Sure, we'll give funds, but where do the funds go? Mm-hmm. Where are the scholars? I don't know. I've raised the question before. Of the people who write climate change, are they from the global north rich? Probably are. How many have global south who are authors from universities in Central Africa or Central America or Southeast Asia? I don't know. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned, I'm editing another book now called Parallel Universes. And this becomes quite obvious when you think about what our knowledge base is about something. Think, for example, about the parallel universes of women and men in some Arab countries.
Mm-hmm.
The men have rights. The women are basically segregated. But there's a big difference between Morocco and United Arab Emirates, isn't there? There's a big difference between Egypt and Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
But so it's growing up, experiencing life in a parallel universe is quite different.
And there are differences between urban places and rural places within those countries.
Right. That's right. And look at the racial geography in the United States. You know, I have somebody contributing a chapter that's going to look at racial segregation in the South in the 1950s and 1960s. And I want this person to contact elderly people, give them a county map, and show them where were the routes, highways, roads you could travel and you could not travel.
Mm-hmm.
It's a segregated space. And to me, showing on a map, showing signs that say whites only on this road, that's more important to me in learning today than simply talk about racial segregation in terms of words. You can do the same thing with ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel and secular Jews, couldn't you?
Mm-hmm.
You could look at women and men, rich and poor, gated communities, and other kinds of communities where the outsiders live in a different space from the rich and the elites. They never intersect. They live in parallel universes. That's why it's a good concept to think about photographically and cartographically. And
well, I can see with this line of thinking how your department in Kentucky really facilitated the development of programs associated with the geography of women and gender studies and these efforts associated with ameliorating social injustice and environmental injustice.
Right.
You know?
And I think many students will seek graduate programs that are looking to address some of these social injustice issues,
Mm-hmm.
whether it be environmental, whether it be gender, whether it be political. And to me, it opens up a whole new, not a can of worms, but a whole new bucket of opportunities for learning and relearning. And media.
It certainly does. You commented on how the faculty and your department at Kentucky were pretty stellar and how editorships were symbolic, really, of that kind of excellent role that they are perceived to have in the academy. But I think also one must look at the graduates of your doctoral program who gain appointments in various doctoral programs elsewhere across the country. And your record is pretty good. And I think that's another indication of how a program that is not in one of the top universities in the country has become really one of the top geography programs in the country.
Yeah.
No?
Well, I think that's true, and I think that's important in attracting graduate students, but I think it's very important in attracting faculty, attracting new faculty. And I think, as I said, I think that the department hires faculty. I have nothing to do with hiring because I'm retired, but the department hires faculty that can fit into this niche, this niche, this niche, and this niche. And the students, advisory committees kind of go maybe these four here and these four over here, but it's just a different mix. So I think I think that the department and departments and universities need to take a look at what are the best ways in which to integrate knowledge and to train professionals for the future. Certainly the model when I was brought up, that's no longer acceptable, which is good because that's sort of, I would call sort of a silo complex.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's more, we know what's more of a muesli concept where the people can mix together. And that's important, I think, in not only attracting faculty, but also in attracting graduate students. You know, it's just like graduate students, strength comes from meeting people from different disciplines, different perspectives, different insights, and looking towards evolving these kind of networks that are out there, rather than simply training everybody to do the same thing.
Well, we certainly thrive as a discipline with eclecticism, having
Yes.
individuals that can pursue studies in different areas. And the right thing to do is to address matters associated with social injustice. I have argued that it's really characteristic of a current paradigm in American geographic thought.
Right.
We do have this endeavor in our programs, in our research, to address these issues. It's very important, and it's very different, of course, than what you've experienced in your long path in your career. You have conducted field work across the globe, places that many people only dream about. Central Asia, Latin America, there's many places, and you've edited books on a variety of subjects. You've really done a lot. And I would just like to ask you, with about a minute or two to go here, as people can read your books and people can, get a handle on some of your research, but they may not be able to get an idea about your leadership in a department unless you're able to share it with us now. And so I'll ask you to share with us, with just a minute or two to go here, some of your thoughts on leadership in an academic department, and maybe what kinds of advice you might be willing to give to prospective students in geography and colleagues in the field.
Well, I think the best professional I would look for in chairing a department or bring on as a faculty member would be a person who has more questions than answers to anything. And also a person who is willing to share concepts, methods, technologies with people in other disciplines. It's very much of a network world to me to be successful these days. The people I have the most difficult with are the people who want to do the same thing for 40 and 50 years. Well, to me that's building an island which is going to be inundated by global warming. But I think that the success of any department, any scholar, is going to be the extent of your knowledge network and exchanging with some degree of humility, but also a great deal of compassion. I communicate with people around the world every day. I learn that's why I write articles and books and chapters with them. I find much more in common than maybe other people do. But I think it's in a couple points, I think, in closing, is it's kind of like looking at the world in terms of the book that came out in the 1960s or 70s, I'm okay, you're okay. And I think that's to me is a growth. If you accept that as your philosophy, then you're going to continue to learn and to relearn. If you think you know the answers of everything, you're digging yourself into a deeper silo. And I think that the real professional person is going to be one who's able to cross disciplines easily and comfortably. I was thinking today, because I write a poem every week, as my friends know. I write a poem every week and I have for about the past 7 or 8 years. But I think about the poem for this week is going to be something about humanities and the sciences. And I think that, it's just a reflection. I think that COVID has opened up a lot of doors that were closed before. And one of those doors is looking at COVID as more than simply a health issue. It's political, it's social, it's gender, it's cultural, it's language, it's religion, it's everything. And I think the point I would make is that we have to keep in mind that the humanities are also teaching the sciences about important points about places and about landscapes, about people, about photographs, about drama, about music, and all of those are, to me, they're just as important as learning about a theory. And I think as I see the knowledge world, the humanities and the social science are slowly blending together in some degree, way, shape, or form. So let's hope that continues, because it's a never-ending process. Take you out of your comfort zone. That's my motto in life.
I think going outside the comfort zone is certainly important.
Right.
I think when we push the envelope, we're compelled to learn more and to develop higher levels of understanding that at times are not comfortable.
That's correct. If you're comfortable, you're getting behind.
I think so. If you're comfortable, you're getting behind.
That's right.
Stan, thanks so much for joining us today. This has been a great conversation.
Same here. Enjoyed it. Okay. Thank you.
Have a wonderful day. And this now concludes this episode of Conversation with a Geographer. Thank you.